Hello, Angela Coté here, and I am excited to have a conversation today with Grant Bullington of FranNet, who's going to talk to you about how to best use a franchise consultant to help you find. I should start over because I already slipped that up, and I promise that was just a one-off. We're gonna.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, Angela Coté here, and I am excited to have a conversation today with Grant Bullington of FranNet, who's going to talk to us about how to best use a franchise consultant to help you find the right franchise for you. I'm going to get Grant to explain this in more detail in a minute. But just for context, my background comes from my upbringing with M&M Food Market. My dad's the founder, and we grew over the years to almost 500 locations. And over the years, I had the opportunity to see what happens when people were a great fit as a franchisee for the brand and for just as a franchisee in general. And I had the opportunity to see what happens when they're not. And so I think, Grant, you and I are really aligned on our mission to help franchisors and franchisees get the right fit and really be able to optimize performance and profitability. Anybody that knows me and follows me on LinkedIn or Instagram or listens to my podcast probably knows that I really believe that when we tap into our passion and our purpose, we become unstoppable. So I think it's really important for franchisees that are listening or prospective franchisees in our audience right now. If you're listening and you're thinking, how can I find the right franchise? This is a big piece of it, is finding something that you're passionate about and you're able to tap into your purpose. So you're going to learn a lot today listening to Grant Bullington. So here we go. Are you ready to get rolling, Grant?
Yes. Good morning. Hi. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm finally letting you chime in. Okay. So to start, Grant, let's have you tell a little bit about your background and then getting it kind of into why you decided to partner with FranNet.
Okay. So I'll go back to, I used to be in an industry that at one point I was like exceptionally passionate about, and it was starting to wane. And I had an opportunity to buy a retail store, and I couldn't really come to terms with it. It's like, should I, commit these level of dollars to something that I've got a waning area of passion in, and decided not to do that. And I thought, well, let's do an industry shift. And so I decided to work for 1-800-GOT-JUNK in Vancouver. Not because I knew anything about franchising, secretly because it had been voted, best company to work for. And I thought, well, let's just interview and see what this is all about. And I walked in the door for my first interview there, and it was like a literal threshold that I walked into, because I had no idea about service-based franchises at the time. Mm-hmm. And so I went up starting with a role there that was, really exciting, because I worked with the prospective franchisees to help recruit them to build that franchise system out. And I did that for about 2.5 years. And it was during, a pretty significant boom time of that industry. So it was quite fun. After a while, it did get a little bit repetitive. And so I took a vacation. They missed me, brought me back to run the department. And then we had the Great Recession that was starting. And I kind of knew that my days were numbered there. And so I was, like a lot of folks at that time, let go. And it was November of 2008. So I'm, out there in the mean streets saying, I want to stay in the franchise industry. I wonder, what are my options? And they were not plentiful. Now, I had the fortune of knowing about FranNet. And so that was just one of the stops on my local research, was like, well, what do these folks know? And as it turns out, the owner of that franchise location, so for British Columbia, was looking to exit the business. And so despite it sounding like a really dumb idea, and my family agreed that it was like, you're going to buy a business in a recession, is I did my homework, and I just realized that, not only is this a great option, but given what was going on, it was like, this is also one of the only options. So I decided to move ahead with it, which was terrifying, right? And this is where I think my story sounds a lot like a lot of the clients that I'm working with, that they are, been thrust into some career transition, trying to figure out what the next step should be. And when business ownership comes into play, I can be like, I've been there. And so it's been quite exciting, right? It's a different role than it was selling franchises for 1-800-GOT-JUNK for a few different reasons. I'm sure we'll get into that. But net is it's a much more intimate process, because I take the time to get to know our clients, and we also spend a lot more time as we're working through it together. And I'm working with far fewer people at any one given time than I would be, where it's, your franchise rep and you got 100 people scattered throughout the different process there. As I'm working with, it's got to be manageable so that I have the time available for my clients. So I started with British Columbia, and then there was an opportunity to acquire the Alberta franchise office, which I did, and then just wound up also inheriting the Manitoba and Saskatchewan territory. So that's what I focus in on, is I'm helping people in that 1.1 million square miles find and research franchise opportunities, and I've been doing that for coming up 13 years now.
Oh my gosh, I have so many questions.
Perfect.
So much good stuff just came out of this. One thing that I hadn't, I think I heard your, we've known each other for a little while, and I hadn't heard your story for a while. I think I'd forgotten this piece. What a great example where you, like you said, you were thrust into figuring out something new because of in your situation, it was the recession and being laid off and having to find something new. We hear this all the time, that's what prompts people to look at becoming small business owners, and they don't know how to do it. They want to do it, but they want that support from a bigger company or a franchisor. So now you're helping people go through something that you went through. How cool is that?
Yeah, I think it helps me sympathize with them, and also, not talk in theory. It's like I lived through this, right?
Yeah, that is huge. That makes you so relatable when you're having those conversations that you really care because you went through it yourself. So that's awesome. And just wow, you went from the one, I guess, territory of BC to
Yes.
expanding to Alberta and then Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So you're really making a big impact. That's pretty awesome.
And I'm getting a bunch of WestJet miles too.
Oh, that's always good. And
Yes.
hopefully you'll get to actually use them soon as we get out of this crazy pandemic, as we work our
Yeah.
way.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to FranNet? So FranNet has consultants all over, as far as I know, North America, maybe
Correct.
further.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the mission that FranNet has? So just to clarify again, just to really make sure people understand this, that FranNet, it's a network of consultants helping people do the things that you're doing, helping fit people, match make them to franchises. So maybe you can speak to FranNet's overall mission.
Yeah, I can. And there's really like two halves to the missions, right? Overarching is what we're helping to do is to help, elite franchisors expand their franchise system with superstar franchisees. So herein lies the split, in that for these franchisors, our mission is to go find them superstars. And on the flip side, for the clients, the prospective franchisee, is we're trying to find an opportunity for them that will allow them to become a superstar.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, to touch on your point, so FranNet, we're a franchise system ourselves, and we focus on the regional exclusive territory, which I think is different than some of the other options that you may have out there, because as soon as somebody falls outside of my territory, it may as well be in like Bangladesh. I'm clueless as to like what's going on in that marketplace, who they'd want to talk to in terms of like, other professionals and what have you. So we hand it off to somebody who knows that marketplace intimately. And I think it, has a fair amount to do with, an appreciation for what's going on in those particular marketplaces. Right. And I think that this is one of the struggles that, if I'm from Calgary, right, and for the first, I don't know, 2-3 years, I timed my trips to Calgary, even when it was February, they had a Chinook for me, right? So I didn't really get to experience the extreme weather. And then I started
For
posting
you,
about it.
For you, they had a
For
Chinook
me.
for you.
Yes, just for me. I was like, as soon as I booked my flight, it was like, oh, look at this. There's a Chinook coming. But then I bragged about it. And then it was like, no, we got some minus 35 for you. So in some cases, like, I've experienced it, although on a very short time frame there. But I also understand that this is something that I have to sometimes intervene with the franchisors who maybe have heard about snow, but they live in Florida and they don't really appreciate like what the impact would be in the business. And at the same time, like guiding clients on like, here's what you need to do to figure out like, talk to other similar markets and find out like, how the white stuff and negative temperatures impacts their business. Right. So getting kind of like tactical, almost at the regional fit aspect there as people explore their businesses.
That's interesting. I actually hadn't thought a lot about that, but yeah, it really makes sense that knowing the market and the territory and how that's going to impact business and helping, helping the prospective franchisee, the person thinking of becoming a franchisee, understand how that's going to impact them as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about, if I'm thinking of becoming a franchisee, what, if anything, what would be the downside? Like, why wouldn't I use a franchise broker? Like, I can't understand why people wouldn't just connect with someone like you. Is there an objection that you hear that people need to hear the response to? There's no cost to them, right?
There's not, right? So we're paid on the referral fee basis. So when our clients move ahead with the franchise, I have to do some paperwork and the franchisor pays us a referral fee.
Yeah.
So a couple things on that is one is that, for the franchisor, they only have to reward us if we find them a superstar. If I send them a dud and it doesn't move ahead, then of course there's nothing there. And then for our clients, it doesn't cost any more because they found the business through me versus had they found it on their own. And then second is I don't get paid more if my clients buy a more expensive business. So it's fairly straightforward there, I think. And obviously I'm biased. Like, why wouldn't you work with a franchise consultant? I mean, we have some limitations, right? One of which is I don't work with every franchise under the sun. Generally what we see is like the extremely well-known brands. I mean, they have like this gravitational pull for more inquiries. I'm sure that, the big ones got, 10,000 leads already this morning. They do not need 10,001. So there's, and there's certain categories that, there may be lots of franchises in that space. We just elect not to work with them. And so that's, one of the areas that, again, like I mentioned, that we're trying to help like these elite franchisors. We don't work with everybody, right? We have to, it's actually a fairly lengthy process for a franchisor to, come into what we would call the inventory, where I'm then able to be able to show them. And I do appreciate the amount of efforts that our head office does, because, when we do have a new partner that comes into play, is that I'm not going to lose sleep when I'm introducing my client to that business, because we know that they've taken like a deep dive, right? Our legal teams looked at the franchise agreement, our finance teams looked at their, and we consultants will volunteer to actually, call existing owners, ask the same questions that an owner or a prospective franchisee would, and report those findings back up. And it just has to be that, all signs are pointing to this business looks like it makes sense, right? It's been around for long enough. There's enough history there that, somebody can actually wrap their arms around some data when they're going through the research, and on the whole, what they hear is positive, right? Yeah. So if somebody's looking to get into, like a franchise system that, they watched Dragon's Den 2 years ago and they have 3 franchisees, I am also not the conduit for that. But, generally the biggest struggle that we have is, like awareness, right? And I find it kind of laughable that, FranNet, we've been around in Canada since 1990, and yet so many people are like, wow, I had no idea you were out there, right? Mark, just getting people to know that franchise consultants exist and how we can help, that's an ongoing challenge, right? And I realize I'm never going to become a household name.
Well, hopefully maybe this CFA podcast will help.
Every little bit helps. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So a couple things that you said there that I want to kind of just double click on. So I really like any franchisor into your inventory and say, yeah, we'll sell your business. So you're really vetting, and that's a huge benefit to a prospective franchisee that you're already vetting. Now, you mentioned, I just want to clarify this for people that are new to potentially becoming a franchisee, that, the legal documents, for example, they need to be very much in favor of the franchise. It looks like they're in favor of the franchisor, but that's because it needs to protect your investment as a franchisee. So you guys are taking a look at those legal documents, the FDD, franchise disclosure document, and the franchise agreement, and saying, yep, this looks reasonable. So that's really cool. Are there, I guess, in terms of the criteria, so you're making sure, I guess you're making sure it's a viable business model. Is that like, how would you say what are you looking for to make sure that you feel comfortable showing these options to prospective franchisees that you're working with?
We have to hear in our, vetting out, as well as on an ongoing basis. I want to point out that just because a franchisor gets in the front door doesn't mean they are permanently, a fixture in our inventory. We will sometimes put people in the penalty box to figure things out, and folks are, asked to leave if they're, if they wind up having some situations that they aren't able to remedy to our satisfaction. We will, stop working with that franchisor.
Grant, can you give an example of a situation? Like, can you just what's an example of a situation that you might put them in the penalty box for? Which I love that, by the way, especially being Canadian.
Yes, very Canadian. So an example would be this, is that we had, and so these disclosure documents, they expire every year, which means that, the most somebody would base their decision on is, 364-day-old data. And, we had a concept that they had a pretty significant amount of franchisee turnover. And so it
Mm.
was like, hold the phone, don't show this concept for a little bit. We need to, get in and investigate it. And despite, the attrition is they had a really, acceptable response to it. And it was basically that, most of the franchisees were in California, which was the hardest hit in the recession. And second is that most of these franchisees, it was the second income into a household. And in a lot of cases, the number one breadwinner was relocating out of state. And it was like, they're not going to hang back to, have this business, continue to operate. And it was also really low cost franchise, which meant that there wasn't a catastrophic cost
Yes.
to walking away from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so after some, research, then it's like, okay, this one's, kind of acceptable. But if we have a situation where, I don't know, franchisor goes on a warpath and they just start like terminating and just litigating a lot of franchisees, that is a kind of a major change. Although generally we find that, a franchisor, it's pretty rare that they're going to, change their tune significantly, right? We'll oftentimes see that, a franchise has been around for 20 years and you go to the disclosure document and you're going to look for like, oh, let's read about all these juicy lawsuits. And it's a blank page with a watermark up the middle that says intentionally left blank, right? Because when they do have challenges, and they all do, is they solve them like, just adults, and they don't necessarily need to get lawyers involved. That it's pretty rare that you'd have a franchise system that overnight would just turn into, like a sport litigator. So that's pretty rare.
Right. Okay. So this is awesome for people to understand that you really have their back. You're looking for these things. And it's interesting because I often, when people ask, and I'm not a franchise consultant like you are, like I'm not doing the matchmaking, but I do get asked a lot of, how do I know if this is a good franchise to invest in? People will ask that. And we say, look at the disclosure document and see what the turnover has been. But like you said, like why? And sometimes the why, maybe they actually gracefully moved franchisees out that weren't a fit and help them sell their business or help them move on so that they could start fresh, or like this stuff happens. But to have an expert like you there helping these prospective franchisees understand all that is really, really cool. I also want to understand, I'm kind of, I guess we're going to leave that topic for a minute. How would someone know that you have their best interest as a prospective franchisee? Like, now one thing you mentioned, that I think you mentioned that you get the compensation for you isn't dependent on the brand that you match them with. But how would I know you're really looking out for my best interests versus just trying to, kind of close a deal?
Well, our head office actually literally led the charge on creating the broker disclosure document. So we give that to all of our clients, and it was pretty much us getting in front of, any concern about, what's going on with this franchise industry. It came out of the US primarily because, there were some dirtbag consultant organizations out there. And of course, we didn't want to get, hauled into that. And so this is where, somebody can at least get an understanding about like the full spectrum of like who we are, our background, almost like the same level of detail that you would find about an organization in a franchise disclosure document, is you're able to find that out. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to a trust. I mean, every single conversation that I have with a client, I mean, I should be making them feel like that they are in good hands, right? And that, my activities kind of like back all of that up. And it really just starts with that conversation. And I mean, the fact that like people are free to go at any time, like I never sign a contract with our clients. They don't have to buy a franchise that we've talked with. If they don't get along with me, that's totally fine. Right. And I think it's just no different than, I mean, we even tell people like when it's the part where it's like, okay, now we're going to talk to some franchise lawyers, is we give them a few different options. And my recommendation is talk to them. They're all really good at what they do. Go with the one that you feel like, you connect with the most. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing for here. Right. And I would hope that they ask me a lot of questions that would then, put themselves at ease about, do I want to work with this Grant guy or not?
Mm-hmm. Do you ever find that, I'm guessing this happens, but do you find that people come to you and you can see right away that they don't have, I always talk about the DNA of a high performing franchisee. Do you have people that, like candidates that want to become a franchisee, and you can sense right away that I don't think you're going to like being a franchisee, and so like I don't actually recommend you go this path? Do you ever have that happen?
There's I always go on like the slightly negative and skeptical. Like, am I sure this client's going to be a good fit for this business, right? And I actually, prescribe them to do that same thing, right? Because when you have somebody who's always dreamed about owning their own business, and now it's like on the doorstep of becoming a potential, there's that risk that they get like excited and positive, and they, install some blinders and potentially miss some pretty big facts there. From my standpoint, I appreciate, like, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell who's going to be a good fit and who's not going to be a good fit. But I do certainly look for, indicators that they are committed to gear up for the research process. And, true story, I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who was filling out like one of the preparatory questionnaires, right? And the second one is like, for the next 3 to 4 months, do you have 10 to 20 hours a week prepared to dedicate for this? That was as far as he got. And then we had a conversation and really discovered it's like, no, like this would be like number 6 on his list of really important things that he's got on the go. So we decided like, now's not the time for this. And, frankly, we always have that conversation that it's like, we need to go gather all this data and then we can make our decision. And we also have to be honest with just how much time and effort it's going to take. And are we emotionally prepared for the wild roller coaster that is ensued, right? So generally folks are like, about like a timing standpoint, like, yeah, I'm prepared to make a decision in 3 to 4 months. And from a timing standpoint, yes, I can open this business in the next, 6 to 9 months. That's fine, right? And we also, need to see like, what do they bring to the table? Right. Because there's some folks who like dream of own their own business. And, you get to know them and you're like, I don't think so.
Yeah,
Right.
that's kind of what I'm getting at. Because I would think that you would see that and you'd see those things, and you don't want a bad track record. Like back to kind
No.
of, and I think that kind of goes back to the question of how do we know you have their best interest? Well, you don't want failures. Like you don't want people coming back to you 6 months or a year later after they signed up for this business, opened, especially if they invested a bunch of money because it's a brick and mortar, maybe a retail concept or something. And they say, Grant, you put me into this business and it wasn't a fit. And didn't you see it? Like I'm sure you're trying to get a good track record. So you're gonna bring those things up.
Yeah. And I also think like 2 things that I do to help this, and they're both somewhat self-serving, right? Is that the entire time that I'm working with a client is I'm always asking myself if they called me up, and this is just theoretical, but I said, hey Grant, would you come in on this, like 10, 20, 30% on the business, private silent investor, like would you do it, right? And I use that as like a litmus test and have a conversation with myself about like, would I do that, or is that causing some cause for concerns? And if it is, then it's like, perhaps we have some agenda items to discuss. And then the second thing is like purely selfish. And I noticed this after about 2 years in my business, is that the work that I did in the first 2 years generated a tailwind, if you will. And nothing makes my job easier than when my clients today get to validate. And some of the folks that they talk to were people that I helped into that same business 3, 4, 5 years ago and are doing exceptionally well.
Mm-hmm.
Is that flywheel effect is considerable, right? And I certainly wouldn't want a so-so franchisee coming in and disrupting that effect, by kind of throwing a wrench in the works.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I expected, that, yeah, you want referrals, and when you say validate it, just for people to understand, I think what you mean by that is when new prospective franchisees talk to an existing franchisee and the person says, yes, this was a good investment, that you want to hear that. You want that for all the reasons.
You do. And you also want to hear it's okay, but, or I left and this is why, right? Is so that you get that full perspective. Because again, like, don't base the research on, just the superstars, right? Because what if you're not a superstar, like, or just to get a sense of like, this is how other people screwed this business up, and at least you're aware of it. And you can kind of avoid that, pitfall coming into it. And here's the thing that I see is that Canadians are pretty conservative when we compare ourselves to the folks in the US. And I think there's some pretty major reasons why that. A, is super easy to get lots of investment or loans in the US. And then second is that a lot of your retirement funds, they are not impacted with the bankruptcy. And I also think it's not as like sacrilegious to go bankrupt in the US. And so you wind up with this like, just do it mentality there. And Canadians are like, well, hang on a second here. Like they tend to be a lot more petrified And they're also not willing to risk as much of their net worth into a business. And the fact that they come pre-programmed with that, significant risk aversion, again, makes my job easy, because when I suggest that let's take a dark look at this and let's look at some of the reasons why it might not work out, or even go really dark and say, and we do this with all of our clients, is like, let's not think up the situation, but in your second year, it's just not working. You need to get out of your business. Walk me through what those exit options are like.
I love that, because you're bringing in a real level of, that is credibility right there. When you're saying, let's get really real with this. It's actually interesting you mentioned this, because I'm pretty sure the article was in the CFA magazine a few years ago about the difference between Canadians and Americans, and that, in Canada, we need more information and we want to be a little bit more strategic. So I love that you're really helping them do that. One other thing I often find, when people are thinking of becoming a franchisee, sometimes they just also need some help kind of taking the leap. Like, do you sometimes help people where you see this looks like it's going to be a big fit? Nobody, like you said, you don't have a crystal ball. Nobody can guarantee anything. But sometimes that's, an entrepreneur that starts their own business from scratch and is really scrappy, they maybe don't need that because they're naturally more, risk tolerant. But somebody who is thinking of becoming a franchisee, usually it's because they want a little bit of security. So do you find sometimes you're kind of coaching people to take that leap?
I find they come to me like pretty excited, and they're like, hey, I want to get into my own business, and they see the value of going with the franchise route, because I come along and that organization's already made 2 million mistakes and I don't have to repeat any of them. And yeah, you pay a fee up front to join, and then there's ongoing royalties, and that's really a big part of the discovery process, is to confirm that there's value to justify those fees. I think the real way that we start by providing value for our clients is that when somebody's like, oh my God, I want to be into business, and they're like, getting in the starter's blocks, is sometimes it's us that says, hang on, your shoes aren't tied.
Okay.
Right.
It's the other way. You're slowing them down a little bit to make sure they're thinking it through.
Slowing it down. And so we do, if I were to look at like a time intensity map of, the working with a client, it tends to be almost like bookended with some pretty extreme time commitment. Again, that's one of the reasons why I don't work with, like hundreds of clients at any one given time, because the initial investment from my hours in is fairly significant. And the client is equally participating in all of that time. And the idea is that step 2 is let's talk about some specific franchise opportunities. Step 1 is let's craft this particular game plan there. And we do a number of steps. The first is, what's going on? What are you looking to do? Why are you looking to do this? And I specifically ask, just why now, right? And let them talk. And they should be able to, fill that void with, a lot of compelling reasons that they've thought this through. And there is that strong desire to get in there, and it's also kind of grounded. And then we use a psychometric profile called the entrepreneurial profile, and it's really helpful because it asks them a ton of annoying questions, and somewhere we look back at or highlights and lowlights in your career. If you think about the things that you're good at and or would like to avoid, just again from your careers, now that we can start to see what the direction would look like, and then it's quite helpful because there's a dozen different results types for that, right? And it's not like we're trying to put people in boxes, like everything's on kind of like a range or a spectrum, but our franchise partners, we actually allow them to have their franchise system take the same version of our assessment. So then they can literally go in the back room and correlate what profile types do well in our business. And that's where my matchmaking becomes easy, because our franchisors say, these are the profile types that do amazing in our business. This is who we want to talk to. And by the way, these ones, they never do great in our business. They'll probably be good in somebody else's, just not ours. Please don't tell them about us.
Yeah.
And then we also get the investment question right out of the way, right? And obviously they're going to share their net worth statement. I could grab my calculator and tell them how much they could invest, but really what it comes down to is what their preference would be. And sometimes you'll have somebody who's maybe younger and they're willing to go deeper as a percentage of their net worth, or you have folks that if they're 50 or 60, they're I'm pretty close to retirement. Now's not the time to swing for the fences. And we'll have conversations as well as what they're looking to get out of the business and really establish that criteria. And I think spending the time to do that up front really pays dividends when it's about to make that decision. Because then it's like, okay, remember 3 months ago, we set out on a mission and 3 months is roughly the average timeline it takes to do the research, this is what we were going to go find. This business is the last one standing. How close to bullseye does it come? And all these things that we have there. And by then they've really identified, and we've prioritized, the must-haves in the business, the nice-to-haves, and then a bunch of other things there. And we just make sure that we maintain the consistent priorities there, so that we're not buying a business on like, oh, I love their logo, because that doesn't matter, right? What we really want to focus in on is, what do you do day in, day out if you own this business? Is that what's going to be really enriching and rewarding for you? Because if it's not, then let's look at a business where you're going to be getting up before your alarm goes off in year 3, 4, and 5, and you're still kind of really invigorated there. So we spend the time figuring out like what that match would be like. Whereas I think the automatic, instinct for a lot of folks is they have a really good experience at a franchise, and then it like dawns on them, they're like, oh my God, wouldn't it be great if I owned one? And it's like, maybe. We got to figure out a whole bunch of factors before we decide whether or not that's really a good fit as well. So, and the idea is that we just narrow things down, right? So that we're not going to go and try and look at, there's 1,300 different franchise concepts in Canada that would take you like decades to go through, and new ones would be coming on. What we find is, in order to do that proper level of due diligence to make this caliber of a decision, if we start off with 4, you'll regret looking at 4, and then we perhaps park one, or one becomes evident that's not a great fit, and continue to taper down as we escalate the amount of time that we spend in a business. But if somebody comes and they want to just, take a quick look at 10 or 15 different franchise concepts, that is like just doing a drive-by, right? There's no time to really learn whether or not it's a good fit, right? So we'll sometimes have to, get people to just agree. It's like, we're going to do things differently than maybe you thought it was going to be, but we've got this process, and we've only helped, like thousands and thousands of people in FranNet work it. And again, that's one thing that I look for, is that if somebody is agreeing to follow our process and really be like a good student on that aspect, that usually is a good indicator that they'll get to the end of our process, and then second is that they'll also be a good franchisee, right? Blindly capable of following a process, even if it's not immediately apparent why.
Great point. Yeah, it's definitely a great test. If you can follow that system and that process, then you'll probably be able to follow the process of the franchisor. Again, you said a bunch of awesome stuff in there. I want to, part of me wants to go back on some of it. I also want to make sure I ask you a few more questions. So, what are some things, maybe just a couple quick things that prospective franchisees should ask in their franchise search? So what, through you or however they're doing that, what are some things they should look for?
I think the biggest one is, to understand, like, what is my life going to be like if I own this? Right. And I think that, it's so easy to, draw an incorrect parallel, because you assume, right. And I think sometimes people will assume that if they buy, a business that's really fun to be a customer of, that it will be equally fun to own that same business. Or on the flip side is, they look at a business and they're like, I would never want to do that, and they walk right by it. And meanwhile, if you stuck around to learn, it's like, actually the owner never does what the frontline employees do. Right.
So
and not to pick on any particular industry, but when I'm giving workshops, I'll talk about like a home cleaning franchise, and you just see like all the faces in the room are like, oh, gross. Like, I would never want to do that. And meanwhile, it's just like, here's how you spend your time if you own that type of a business. And here's what your employees do, right? They do the cleaning. It's a white collar executive type of a model. And so there are different approaches to, go and find that one. But I think like the first question is, and again, you're not going to be like, okay, great, after hearing like one response. It's the body of knowledge is to just, what do I do if I own this business, right? And you really want to make sure that like that's where the ultimate fit is. Because if it's managing employees, right, you might find that if you have a business that you don't have any employees to manage, that again, it's a kind of a hollow existence for you. Or on the flip side is, if you're like, I don't like managing employees, and you bought that home cleaning franchise because you fell in love with the economics of it, you may really regret your decision when you built to like 40, 50 employees, right? Because you're like, well, that's 45 more than I wanted.
Totally. You're hitting the nail on the head on this. It's actually very interesting. Just yesterday, I facilitated a roundtable of franchisors, and I was challenging them on what's your differentiator and what what do you say to somebody who says, why would I buy into this brand? And you're so right. The cleaning companies, we had a guy on there from a pool cleaning company. And it's like, it's not about the cleaning the pool, it's about the growing people. Or, do you like the idea of growing and managing humans? Because that's
Yeah.
often what the job is. And actually, it's funny that you said what, because when I was a franchisee myself for 18 years of family business, M&M Food Market, and people would come in and they're like, wow, it looks like you're just printing money. This looks great. I want one of these. And I'm like, do you know how like that? Like you have to be able to attract and retain entry level employees that are going to have to work in a freezer and work with customers. Now, if you get a kick out of that and you love leadership and you love people, perfect. But if you think you're just going to stand there and print money, you're not. So you're right. Like you really, as a prospective franchisee, you want to think about what do you like, and you're right to don't look at the brand. Like we had, a shipping company on our call yesterday, and it's not about being a person that manages shipping. It's about managing people and we talked about the emotion of what that can bring, like the happiness that the business provides. So if it's a cleaning company, like you mentioned, does it get you excited to know that you're helping people with their homes, or, if it's a painting business, making their home look better or whatever it is. So
Mhm.
there's some really great points. I've got a couple more questions here, unless you wanted to quickly address that.
Well, just real quick, I mean, that is like one of the overarching themes for the validation, right? When you get on the phone with the owners, is just that's when you get to ask them, like, what is your life like, right? And you'll probably hear different versions of that because, in some cases, like franchisees may want to emphasize, certain aspects of the role, and they, bring somebody on to focus on other areas. But that's where you really get like a window into the future of what your life would be like if you owned that business. And again, you're hearing directly from franchisees who are going to be honest with you, right? Especially if it's not what they'd signed up for.
Yeah, that is one of the best things that a prospective franchisee can do, right? Is go talk to the other franchisees in the system, and not just the superstars, but
No.
like you sort of alluded to this before, but what if it didn't work out? Why isn't it working out? Maybe for that person, it wasn't a fit. So it doesn't mean it's terrible, or maybe you're like that person and it won't work for you. So I think that's really important. I really want to ask you, because you've been in this for quite a number of years, how have you seen the consulting industry change since you've been in it? So the way that organizations like you or yours and how you support prospective franchisees.
So it overall has, grown. And I don't necessarily know if the growth is, from the prospective franchisees, like, that there's more firms like this out there. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because you asked on this question like earlier, kind of like on the trust factor there. And I'm not meaning to sling mud of, some other companies who from the outside look like they do what we do. But, you'll sometimes find it's like, hey, I've been a consultant for 5 minutes and I've never owned a franchise before, right? Are they going to be able to guide you through, have that kind of like level of expertise, or that there's, some cases where, and I've heard this from, clients that came to me and they're like, I was working with somebody else and, they couldn't even pronounce the name of my town right. They kept saying attorneys and not lawyer, and they just got the heebie-jeebies. It's like, I'm not in good hands here. Or they showed me 50 businesses and asked me to pick one off the list. And it's like, well, why do you need a broker? Because there's, go to the CFA, look for a franchise. You could click all those buttons if you want. I don't think that helps you find a franchise. But I think overall is that you see that every year, the number of franchisee transactions, the number that come through like franchise consultants continues to tick up, right? And I think it has to do with two fronts. One is that finding franchisees has become a hyper competitive and super expensive game.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you have these franchisors that, come along and they might be doing absolutely everything right. And they have, like 25 franchisees, and now they're in a sea of, like over 1,000 different. How do they kind of even get in front of or engage in the conversation with people who have like so many options and are getting wooed by, they go and they're seeing like all the banner ads from companies who will literally pay more in the actual acquisition cost to find that franchisee than that franchisees pay. Like they go totally upside down, right? And then of course we've seen that trade shows obviously for the last couple of years have been like a non-factor, right? And so companies are like, well, how are we going to find this, right? And you talk about it in some of your podcasts that it needs to be like a Parthenon strategy. There is no such thing as a silver bullet where you're going to find all of your franchisees. And for the right franchisor, we're one of those pillars, right? But what we see generally is that pillar has become larger and larger for a lot of franchise systems. And I think it's just because economics, they only have to compensate us when we found them a superstar. But then more importantly is that the caliber of owners that we find them, they're just, because of the relationships that we have in play at the local market level, they're never going to be able to get in front of the folks that we're able to introduce them to. And I guess they see the value in that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Wow. Lots of good stuff there too. And I think one of the things that's really standing out for me is if somebody is thinking of using a franchise consultant, or sometimes called brokers, to does the person understand what it's like to go from not being a business owner to being a business owner? And again, you have such a great story where you had to figure it out and you became a franchisee yourself of FranNet, and look at the success you've had. That's such a great story. And so like that relatability is good. One other thing I think just real quick, I want to just mention for people is that a change that I'm sure you've really seen is the growth from, it used to be franchising was all about quick service restaurants, the Dairy Queens and the A&Ws. And I actually know that even back in 1980, going way back, when my dad decided to franchise M&M meat shops, that was even a little bit unusual. And now we've got, like window cleaning franchises. And I mean, I've got a client who's a Spanish daycare immersion, so many, or Spanish immersion daycare. There's just so many different neat things out there. And as we talked about earlier, it's not always about the actual service. Sometimes it's about being a business owner that, draws people in. So very last point here. Actually, I want to make sure people know where they can get a hold of you. So let's make sure we fit time for that. But real quick, one last tip for anybody. Is there anything else you missed that you want to make sure people hear or reemphasize, that if they're thinking of becoming a franchisee, that they should be aware of, or advice that you have?
I think the first thing is to be able to articulate all the layers of what your plan is, right? And it starts with why I want to be in business, but then we should back it up with, and this is how it's going to happen, and this is what I'm looking for, this is what I want to avoid, and this is how it's going to fit, not just for me in the time that I spend working in my business, but then how that fits with the rest of my lifestyle. Right. So what does your family think about you getting into this business? Right. Even if they're not going to be involved in the day to day, they'll be impacted by that decision. Right. So how does that make sense? And then bigger picture, is this a smart investment that's going to get you better prepared for retirement as you go? And I mean, we just, they're ever present, the major pitfalls that people fall into. And the first one is that they make a decision based primarily on emotion. Right. Wouldn't it be great if I had an ice cream shop? Because who doesn't like ice cream? And it's well, there's some downfalls to it, right? And then the second one is just, failing to make an appreciation for this is how I spend my life, in this business. These are what my waking hours are, right? So trying to avoid that whole emotional thing. And it's really hard because how do us humans not get emotional on things? And then it's also, so when we go from this is going to be amazing, then what, replaces that as the negativity, right? And we're all naturally negative, some people a little bit more than others. And it will help you out in that you're coming up with the reasons, challenges that the business may have, right? And really it's just a matter of writing those down and going and finding out is weather a factor? Is investment a factor? What does it take to screw this business up? How can I be successful at it? And then I think one of the things that, we always just remind folks is we're going on a journey together, and we're going to spend months encountering massive amounts of data, and then at the end be able to make an informed decision. And you're going to also have to go through those same period of time without getting swayed from what we call the ambush, right? And it happened to me. Hey, I'm thinking about buying this business, and I, had to spend a week with my family over Christmas, and all I endured was like, Grant, you're an idiot. Like,
Right.
not fall almost victim to this like armchair quarterback that guaranteed you're going to get exposed, right? Anytime you pick up a article about franchising, it's rare that it's positive in Canada, right? And when you just, you're going to friends and neighbors, and you just ask yourself, it's like, hey, are these people that I would specifically go to for advice on this decision? If they're not, tune them out. And then second is just ask yourself, how much do they know about it, right? If they know nothing and they're just like, yeah, whatever, maybe just keep that in mind. And then, family's sometimes the worst, right? We've all got that one Uncle Charlie. He never followed his dreams, and so he's going to rain all over yours too. Just tune Charlie out. Like, don't talk to him.
Yeah. It sounds like, getting really real and doing lots of research and introspection and then getting support. So, all right, in wrapping up, Grant, what is the best way for people to track you down? I'm sure that you've really opened up a lot of people's minds. So what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Well, I think the easiest would be to go to frannet.com. We've got a lot of resources on the website there. And then in the upper left corner, if you punch in your postal code, it'll take you to your local FranNet consultant. And you got a couple of different options. There's a telephone number there if you want to have that initial conversation. You can send an email. You can go straight to filling out the entrepreneurial profile, or book a call with the individual consultant and go from there. If you happen to be in Western Canada, I'm happy to help you out. If you're in other parts of Canada, you're also in very good hands as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, this has been so good. Thank you so much for all your insights and really helping clarify what is the best way to get the most out of using a franchise consultant. So thank you so much, Grant.
Outstanding. Thank you, Angela.